Lately I've been thinking about the zombie genre, its place in the horror genre, and the general status of it nowadays. Now, zombies in terms of history and culture can have its roots traced back to voodoo magic, but in terms of fiction and media, the zombie genre and its prime origins can be traced back to two main sources. The first is, of course, Night of the Living Dead, a film that's so widely available because of its public domain status that you can watch it on Wikipedia of all places. It's considered a classic of the horror genre, and where the zombie genre really got its pitfalls started, really. And rightfully so. Night of the Living Dead was a game changer for the horror genre, really broke some new ground. And Romero deserves a lot of credit for what he brought to the table with this one movie, and also just kickstarting what the zombie genre could be like. But it wasn't just for the fact that what Romero did to zombies is what really made this film kind of groundbreaking, and there's a tons of other ways you can describe this movie, really. But I guess one thing that does kind of, some of what makes Night of the Living Dead really stick out is the fact that it doesn't really play how you think it's going to go exactly. What you think will happen doesn't actually happen, and usually doesn't end up very well. Anyone who's seen the film pretty much knows what I'm talking about. It's also probably the best movie that you can probably find in the public domain, barring Carnival of Souls, but I digress. The other source, though perhaps not as obvious, is Richard Matheson's post-apocalyptic horror classic, I Am Legend. Now, I Am Legend is not a story with zombies so much as it involves vampires, but some of the elements in I Am Legend, you can kind of feel its presence, and elements of it carry over into other zombie media. The book deals with loneliness and isolation, and also what it would be like to be in a world where one person is the only man left remaining, in a society that's basically crumbled, where a new one takes over. It's that kind of thing that I feel like that's where the zombie genre is at its best can be like, as well as other things. These two are pretty much where I feel like the zombie genre and its roots can be traced to. However, the main thing that I've been thinking with the zombie genre is that after the mid 2000s, I feel like the zombie genre really started to become really dumbed down and focused less on what made such an interesting genre of the horror medium, as well as becoming a lot more homogenous and less varied. Now, zombies as a monster can actually be pretty diverse in a lot of ways. They can be science fiction, they can be supernatural, they can be a science experiment gone wrong, they could be aliens. They're a very versatile monster and can work in just about any scenario. It's that kind of variety that I like, and I find what makes the genre interesting when it's done right. Stuff like Dead Heat, Night of the Creeps, The Beyond, Zombie 2, Brain Dead, Return of the Living Dead, or if you want to be really obscure, Biozombie, are all examples that show just how varied and diverse the zombie genre can actually be. And even then, the stories don't exactly have to be strictly about the zombies. They can throw in something a little extra to make it a bit more interesting and whatnot. And that doesn't just apply to movies, really. Now, when it comes to zombie video games, you can't go without mentioning Resident Evil, but the long-short Cliff Notes version of it is this. It's one of my favorite video game series. It's something that I've been a part of for quite a while. I can go on eons talking about it, really analyzing it. But the thing is, though, zombies are only really a part of what makes Resident Evil what it is. There's bioorganic weaponry, evil pharmaceutical companies, and of course, being a video game, Resident Evil was very revolutionary what it did for video games in terms of design, exploration, and so on, among other things. But he also had Dead Rising, a game that not only takes major influence from the Romero film, specifically Dawn of the Dead in regards to its setting, but also sort of its commentary. You had to fight what are called psychopaths, which were essentially bosses or people who were caught in the zombie outbreak but pretty much lost their minds. This is what made Dead Rising interesting because it showed that zombies are not the only thing you had to worry about, other than just the time as well as resource managing. Dead Rising is also one of my favorite video game series. The first three are honestly really fun games, but the first one is the one I have come back to the most admittingly. Even though it does have some flaws regarding like the survivor AI, it does have a very nice open-endedness that you don't really see from a ton of video games at that time, especially ones made from Japan exactly. But while Resident Evil and Dead Rising are definitely probably the most noteworthy examples of the zombie genre in terms of video games, other than possibly Left 4 Dead, you gotta mention at least House of the Dead. House of the Dead practically needs no introduction. It's one of the all-time classics of the rail shooter genre next to Time Crisis. It's a really fun game in its own right. It's also one that really just embodies just being an absolute B-movie of a video game. But while Resident Evil usually gets credit for kind of making zombies more have a presence in video games, House of the Dead played just as much of a role, but mostly in the arcade scene. Regardless, though, I do feel like both of these are pretty much where zombies, at least in terms of video games, where they got their start from. But there's also some other examples. One of my favorite examples is Yakuza Dead Souls, also known as Ryu ga Gotoku of the End. A game that I not only feel is a standout game in its series, but also just one as a zombie game in general. Now, Yakuza is one of my favorite video game series, and Dead Souls for me is one of my favorites. It's a game that works for me on a lot of different levels. For one thing, as a Yakuza game, it's really cool to see characters like Ryuji Goda and Goro Majima be playable for the first time. That is until years later where Goro Majima became playable at Zero. But as a Yakuza game that does have zombies in it, it doesn't feel generic at all. It does feel like it has its own personality that comes from the series, but also was just a general zombie game. Besides zombies, you fight all sorts of various mutants throughout the game that feel like they came out of House of the Dead or Resident Evil. Ryuji Goda has a machine gun arm, and Yakuza's staple crime drama approach to storytelling is definitely in this game, and it melds quite well with the zombie outbreak sort of story going on. It's a good blending of the two, and it's the kind of spin-off from the series we just don't really see anymore. Now, as a game in general, I feel like Dead Souls is quite also a really fun third-person shooter action game. It doesn't play like the typical third-person zombie shooter, it plays like its own sort of thing in its own Yakuza sort of way. Dead Souls, I feel, is a very unfairly underappreciated entry in its series. It's not as good as Yakuza 2, 4, 0, I feel, which are my personal picks for the best in the series. But it does also have a lot of things going for it, particularly not only its story, its sort of unique blending of Yakuza gameplay and third-person zombie shooting, but also, in my opinion, what I feel is one of the best and underappreciated soundtracks in the series. The one problem with Yakuza Dead Souls is that it's been stuck on the PS3 for so long, and really deserves a re-release of some kind. But given the state of the series, I kind of feel like that's probably not going to happen, sadly. There's definitely other video game examples I can mention, such as Stubbs the Zombie, Lollipop Chainsaw, Zombie Revenge, etc. Regardless, I feel the zombie genre can be made interesting if you give something a little extra, or talk about something deeper, something or other, because a lot of the stuff nowadays, or after a certain point, it really isn't that interesting or what makes them kind of compelling, really. I don't know where to pinpoint exactly where it all went wrong after the mid-2000s, but I feel like it's pretty easy to blame The Walking Dead for a lot of this, where it focused a lot more on melodrama rather than anything really all that interesting. Now, there was drama in the Romero films, for example, but it wasn't just all about that. It was other things too, like the social commentary in Dawn of the Dead, for example, the degradation of human society, all sorts of other things, really. If it's just the human drama, and the zombies are really just kind of just a thing that just exists, then it's really not that engaging or really that significant. Despite the sort of downfall that the genre would face eventually in later years, there were still some good examples of the genre in terms of movies. One of these is 28 Days Later, a movie that really breathed new life into the zombie genre. Now, I'm not actually a huge fan of 28 Days Later. To me, it's not on the same level as something like, say, the Romero films or some of the other film examples that I mentioned. But credit where it's due, 28 Days Later did bring in some pretty interesting and frankly smart ideas to the zombie genre that I do feel like are worthy of respect, at least for me anyway. For one thing, the fact that anyone could become a zombie in that movie just from just touching its blood or having it get into your body or something like that really made them feel like a legitimate threat. And the opening itself is actually a really unique way to begin a zombie film, and something that The Walking Dead totally ripped off from, by the way. But for me, when it comes to the last genuinely great zombie movies, it would have to be both Shaun of the Dead and Land of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead is one of my all-time favorites. It's a film that's been talked about for a while for how extremely good it is, and rightfully so. It's a film that spoofs but also homages the Romero films, but also has a really good grasp of what made those movies really work exactly. It hits a very fine line between parody and homage, but also doesn't really feel like it half-asses either. Usually in a lot of parody movies, they would just kind of not really put the effort in for just cheap laughs, really, because hey, it's a joke movie. But Shaun of the Dead really does feel like it's made with a lot of love and effort and appreciation for the zombie genre, and that really does shine through. Shaun of the Dead is probably at least in the top 5 when it comes to zombie movies, I feel. Land of the Dead, however, is a much different story. It's not nearly on the same level of classic as its predecessors, but if you ask me, it still gets my vote for being the best zombie movie of the 2000s next to Shaun. While it isn't Romero at his absolute peak, it really does embody everything what made him such a good filmmaker. There's definitely some commentary here and there, though it's not quite as strong as it was in the previous films, but it's still very entertaining, extremely well made, has a really good cast comprising of John Leguizamo, the guy from The Mentalist, and of course, Dennis fucking Hopper. Land of the Dead is still a pretty damn good zombie movie in its own right. It still feels like it has its own identity that is really quite different from other ones. It feels like the right kind of 2000s horror filmmaking in the best ways possible. That pretty much wraps up what I feel and think about this genre. I wanted to talk about this sort of thing for quite a while now, but just never really found the right opportunity. As well as talk about some of my favorite movies and video games that come from this genre and stand out to me in their own right. I know there's a ton of people who feel that zombies are really boring, and I don't really blame them for feeling that way, given the oversaturation and homogenous nature that they became. But regardless, I feel there's a lot of really good stuff that you can find in this genre, and like I said, you can make zombies interesting. You just have to dig deeper and look to the past to see the really good stuff, and see why this genre became as influential and has its place in the horror genre. And really, that's probably more important now than it ever was back then.